This lecture is focusing on Antebellum Reform, reforming American society. This will focus on the time period of 1800 to 1860. Reform began with the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening began in the early 1800s, where preachers emphasized individual responsibility for seeking salvation. Similar to the First Great Awakening, this was a movement back to church, back to religion, but unlike the First Great Awakening, that was more of hellfire and brimstone, this one focused on the idea of good works and good faith. It promoted individualism and responsibility. One of the big components of the Second Great Awakening was the revival. Charles Finney is the father of modern revivalism, which is an emotional meeting designed to awaken religious faith, conducted through impassioned preaching and prayer. They'd have a big bonfire, a big group gathering, sort of like the picture down below, where the preacher would come and speak, and they might have a big potluck. So the idea of the big community coming together to celebrate the faith. One of the groups that was really this appealed to was the African American church. The belief that all people, black or white, belonged to the same God was highly appealing. Also, slaves interpreted the Christian message as a promise of freedom. Similar to Moses bringing the slaves from Egypt, the Jews from Egypt, from slavery in Egypt. Similarly, the African American community believed that God would free them from bondage in the South. This led to the independent African American churches. They promoted abolition and became political, cultural, and social centers. They also provided education. A lot of times, education was not allowed for African Americans in the United States, or if they received an education, it was segregated. And so the African American church will offer that opportunity. The African American church will become essential after the Civil War for reconnecting families and providing a community after slavery is over. Another religious movement that came from this was Unitarianism. It emphasized reason and appeals to conscience as paths to perfection. This was attracted a wealthy and educated following, and they believed that conversion was a gradual process. We also had a literary movement, as well as a philosophical movement, called Transcendentalism. This emphasized living a simple life, celebrating truth found in nature. Ralph Waldo Emerson was one of the big leaders of this. He believed in individualism and self-reliance. And then you have Henry David Thoreau, who wrote his book on Walden Pond, where he literally went and lived in nature and wrote about it. And he also practiced civil disobedience, which is the breaking of laws you believe to be unjust. People like Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi read Thoreau's writings before they practiced their own civil disobedience. Education was a reform movement from the 1830s. It started in Pennsylvania, with Pennsylvania being the first to establish a tax-supported public school system. It will spread in the 1850s to the north and then to the south and west. Horace Mann becomes the leader in public school reform. He believed that public schools begin with both a good curriculum and good teachers. In order to do that, you need to have an established curriculum, and the teachers need to have a proper training program. Another way to better society is through asylums and prisons. Dorothea Dix was the crusader for the mentally insane. She persuaded states to establish public mental hospitals. Massachusetts will be the first to do so. And the idea was that the mentally ill would often be housed in jails along with prisoners because there was no place to treat them. And she said hospitals would be a much more humane, also better place to treat and be able to send those citizens back into society. When it came to prison reform, they emphasized education. The idea is if you receive an education, or at least a skill set, you can re-enter society better off than when you entered it, and maybe you might not commit any crimes again. Then you have abolition. Abolition is the call to outlaw slavery. One of the first abolitionists was William Lloyd Garrison. He was a white abolitionist who wrote the newspaper The Liberator. He believed in an immediate and uncompensated emancipation. In other words, he believed in freeing the slaves immediately with no payment to slaveholders. He was considered one of the most dangerous man in America because of the fact that he believed in this. To not compensate slaveholders would mean that they had made an investment and they would not receive anything in return and yet have to pay laborers. And in the North, there was such a reliance on the cotton that was being produced by the South that he was considered dangerous to Northern economy as well. When it comes to African American abolitionists, you have David Walker and you have Frederick Douglass. David Walker was a free black who urged blacks to fight for their freedom. He wrote an appeal to colored citizens of the world. Frederick Douglass was born into slavery but escaped to freedom in the North. He believed that an education had been his true path to freedom. Unlike the slave codes, which had banned slaves getting an education, his mistress had taught him secretly. And so by knowing how to read and write, when he pursued freedom, he was able to attain it. And he published an abolitionist newspaper called the North Star. Some slaves fought back against slavery in armed revolt, and one example of that is Nat Turner's rebellion. Nat Turner was a gifted preacher who believed that he should lead his people to freedom. 80 followers will attack 40 plantations in 1831, and they'll kill almost 60 whites. However, as many as 200 blacks were killed in retaliation. Turner was tried and hanged. And places like Virginia, where Turner's rebellion happened, will create stricter slave codes that will make it even harder for slaves to meet, organize, or even receive a religious education, because it will do things like limit the number of people who can get together for religious services, or that they needed to have a white present. Now, there were arguments at the time for pro-slavery. Some of the pro-slavery arguments were the Bible, that the Bible cited passages that told servants to obey their masters. There was the myth of the happy slave, that a slave was a cherished addition to the plantation family. And if you think about it, that slaves were taken care of after they were too old to work, or if they got sick, they were still cared for. That was the argument. Unlike free labor, where if you got sick, you lost your job, or if you got too old, you just had to figure out how to fend for yourself, and that wasn't how slaves were treated. Now remember, this is a myth. This isn't the reality. And as we talked about in the Jackson Lecture, there was the gag rule during this time, limiting or preventing the debate on abolition in Congress. For women, we have the cult of domesticity, which was this idea of separate spheres of influence. That women were, their sphere of influence was in the home, that they were housewives and mothers, and that that was where they had their power, their control, and where they were in charge. Men had their sphere of influence in the workplace, and the two spheres should not mix. Not all women felt that they should just be staying at home. With the Second Great Awakening, many women felt that the reform movements were an extension of their Christian duty, and in some ways an extension of their home life. So you have female abolitionists, such as Sarah and Angela Grimke, who wrote an appeal to Christian women of the South. You have the World's Anti-Slavery Convention, where women went, and when they were denied entrance because they were women, it's going to lead to another movement. But they're going to raise money, distribute literature, and collect signatures for petitions to Congress. Now, one of those, the movement that women are going to get involved in, because they don't have access at the World's Anti-Slavery Convention, will be suffrage, or the right to vote. But another female organization was temperance, which was an effort to prohibit the drinking of alcohol. Okay. There was a belief that alcohol was dangerous. The abuse of alcohol could lead to abuse, poverty, and so Lyman Beecher, who was a Connecticut minister, lectured against alcohol, and he had many followers. So here's an example of all these men drinking and all the problems, and of course at the bottom you have the woman and child who is sad and forlorn because of this. Women are going to seek education beyond primary school, beyond elementary school. And so one of those things will be the Troy Female Seminary, which will be opened by Emma Willard in 1821. This is the first academically rigorous school for girls. And then in 1837, Mount Holyoke Female Seminary will be founded by Mary Lyon, which is the first institution of higher learning for women, which of course becomes Mount Holyoke University. Women get involved in health reform. Elizabeth Blackwell will be the first woman to graduate from medical college in 1849. She'll later open the New York Infirmary for women and children. Women and children had trouble accessing health care because for women, they should not be touched or examined by strange men. And so how do you receive proper health care if a doctor can't examine you? So by having an infirmary for women and children, it gives them better access. Catherine Beecher did a national survey on women's health and found that there were 3-to-1 sick to healthy ratio. And this will help women pursue offering more health reform for women. Things like infirmaries for women and children, and access to proper medical care, especially in childbirth and things like that. And then finally, you have women's suffrage. Seneca Falls in 1848 was the first women's rights convention. This was led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. There they released the Declaration of Sentiments, which started with, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." The most controversial aim of the Seneca Falls Convention almost didn't pass, and that was the right to vote. There were concerns that if women didn't just pursue equal rights under the law, but rather pursued the right to vote, that they might not obtain equal rights. Women won't receive the right to vote until 1920. There was a rise of industry during this time. You have early factories. The cottage industry, where manufacturers would provide materials for goods to be produced at home. You had artisans versus unskilled workers. Your artisans were masters, the most experienced. Then a skilled worker who was employed by a master would be a journeyman. And then you'd have an apprentice, a young worker learning a new craft. But the new factory system that will emerge under Samuel Slater and the Lowell system didn't require anything more than an unskilled worker. So some of the first unskilled workers will be women, the mill girls. Why women? They could pay them lower wages, and they only stayed a few years. The idea was they worked for a couple of years before they would go home and get married and have children. They worked from 7 a.m. to 7:30 p.m., and the conditions they worked under started out okay, but they got worse over time. Things like hot, dark, poor ventilation, windows nailed shut, because when you're working in a textile factory, the conditions had to be at a certain way to make sure that the textiles didn't break or fray. So in 1834, laborers are going to start discussing the possibility of organizing and striking. Unionist power was a proclamation by workers claiming that they would not return to work until wages increased. Strikers returned to work when the leaders were fired. In 1836, the strike will fail again. In 1834, the Lowell Female Labor Reform Association is organized. They'll petition the state legislature for a 10-hour workday. It didn't pass, but it got a local legislator who opposed it. The bill fired. The biggest problem for labor at this time was the fact that unions were not legal, and they didn't necessarily have the right to strike. This was something new that no one had actually anticipated. Another problem for laborers during this time was the rise of immigration. With immigrants coming to this country, they were looking for work, and so they were willing to work in any conditions for any sort of pay. So if people went on strike, there was always an immigrant who was willing to take their job. So the rise of immigration is due to German and Irish immigrants. German immigrants were moving into the upper Mississippi River Valley and the Ohio Valley, mostly farmers, though some were professionals, artisans, and shopkeepers. Irish, on the other hand, were coming in much poorer, and so they often stayed in the cities that they immigrated into: New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. Mostly were unskilled laborers who worked in factories and drove down wages. Our first union will be formed in 1834. It was the largest union of the time, the National Trades Union, and it was organized by journeymen from 6 different industries. In 1842, we'll have our first Supreme Court case in terms of labor, and it will be Commonwealth versus Hunt, which declared that strikes are legal and that workers have the right to organize and strike. It will take a long time, almost 100 years, before labor truly has rights and opportunities here in the United States. But these were the first efforts by various workers and reformers to achieve rights for those who did not have them here in the United States.